just give people a minute to have a seat, and then we'll start our last session of the day. It like flew by. So it's my tremendous pleasure to bring us all back together again to talk about prevention. We started the day talking about prevention and thinking about how we can prevent all causes of mortality in people living with epilepsy. And now we're closing the day thinking specifically about moving towards prevention for SUDEP. If I haven't had the chance to meet you, my name's Elizabeth Donner, and I'm one of our co-chairs of our PAME meeting in our PAME group. And it's really my pleasure to chair this session this afternoon. You know, we've been talking about SUDEP for a lot of years at PAME now, and we really felt strongly like it's time for us to start talking specifically how to prevent it. So we put together this session with kind of an aim of thinking about kind of like multifactorially, what are the different techniques, approaches to prevention of SUDEP and epilepsy-related mortality. And so I have a great slate of speakers for you today. And our first speaker is Iris Maria Killinger, and there's all our speakers right there. So Iris Maria is there at the top left. And Dr. Killinger is actually a criminal defense lawyer, and she has a PhD in penal law. In 2019, she lost her son, Oskar. And since then, she's been doing tremendous work trying to raise awareness of SUDEP. And they have just this amazing campaign we feel so inspired by that we asked Iris Maria to join us today to talk about her experience in building this campaign. And I'll just hand it over to you, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. Did you know that public awareness campaigns can dramatically alter social behavior? My son Oskar passed away from SUDEP in 2019. At just 14, like many, we, his parents, were unaware of this risk. We had no clue that a seizure could lead to respiratory arrest and stop the heartbeat. Our incompetence in managing our child's illness was born out of insufficient information. This experience, being underinformed, even though we cared, took him to a specialist and asked questions, has deeply unsettled us. And there's a stark difference between failing despite knowing the risk and failing while being blinded by comforting lies. The silence surrounding SUDEP stems from pervasive silence and stigma in society about epilepsy. We have all been inadvertent and unconscious participants in the system, and maybe we still are. This needs to change. People with epilepsy and their families don't need false comforts. They need to be heard, to be seen, and to be taken seriously. They need to know the facts about their condition and how to adjust, just like anybody who is ill. As current checks on doctors, even medical guidelines, even in countries like your country, like the US, laws have not yet tackled the SUDEP silence sufficiently. We must leverage public awareness as a tool for change. It can dramatically alter social behavior. In Germany, it already has. Thank you very much for the invitation, PAME. In the upcoming minutes, I'll be sharing what we've come up with to tackle the issue. And our message is one of hope, of empowering change, and of defying limitations. Let's first turn our attention to a short campaign film we have produced for social media. It features the voices of some of our key protagonists. Is it working?
Yeah. Oh, it did. Yeah.
Yeah. This is supposed to be a film.
Oh, is this a video?
Mm-hmm.
Can we play the video, please? In the slide?
Hat man kein Wissen über eine Gefährdung, dann hat man noch nicht mal eine Chance.
Wir haben die Stop SUDEP-Initiative gegründet mit dem Ziel, dass bis 2030 alle Menschen, die mit Epilepsie zu tun haben, das SUDEP-Risiko kennen und es ganz normal ist, darüber aufgeklärt zu sein.
Wenn wir gewusst hätten, dass es SUDEP gibt, würde mein Bruder vielleicht heute noch leben.
Ich mache bei dieser Kampagne mit, damit die Menschen erfahren, wie man in einem Notfall helfen kann.
Dass man das in etwas Schönes verpackt und dass man da auch so professionelle Leute hier ans Set holt. Einfach Wahnsinn.
Weil ich ein sehr großes Päckchen damit zu tragen habe.
Egal wer unter Epilepsie leidet, kann daran leider versterben.
Den meisten, nicht einmal den Epilepsie-Betroffenen, ist SUDEP ein Begriff und das muss sich auf jeden Fall ändern.
Thank you. In the film, you were introduced to persons who live with epilepsy, their children, or their surviving siblings. Astrid lost her brother to SUDEP. Ingo was my son's school principal. Carefully staging real people, setting them in scene is key to our campaign. It focuses on how proper information positively impacts their lives and makes you grow. These individuals are not silent or hidden. They actively share their experiences. The core principle, patients and doctors engage as equals. We did explore other approaches when conceptualizing our campaign, and I would now like to briefly walk you through some of the ideas we considered and why we ultimately discarded them. We decided against displaying our son's image. Utilizing his image is a deeply personal matter and not something I'm comfortable with on a big scale. Furthermore, we wanted our campaign to concentrate on prevention and survival. We think this transports easier with people who are alive. For the same reason, we discarded the idea of using images of corpses, even our son's corpse, or symbols representing deceased SUDEP victims as a viable approach. We actually engaged in considerable discussions about this, as Johan and I were quite convinced about this approach in the beginning. But ultimately, we heeded the advice of experts who pointed out that established marketing theories suggest shock tactics often fail to foster lasting positive engagement or change. We also explored a purely typographic approach. I personally liked it, and still I think that typo could be very effective, but we concluded that typo should rather be an add-on approach for an impactful campaign. We also decided against using stock photos of happy people to symbolize the joy of knowing SUDEP risks. The message felt too simplistic and too generic. It could be an advertisement for anything, even good liability insurance. Additionally, I thought this approach seemed too inexpensive and might contradict what I felt was necessary to tell, a feeling of worthiness. So we went for the Hollywood approach and the glamorous empowerment approach. I was tired of the cheap solutions, the shortcuts, and the neglect shown towards people with epilepsy. I was exhausted by the feeling of worthlessness thrust upon them, by underfunded medicine, by the underestimation and lack of information. I was fed up with hearing that epilepsy isn't a topic for discussion, that there's no budget for epilepsy marketing, that it's not sexy, as Angela Kindl from Charité Hospital in Berlin described it. The job then is make it sexy, I thought. So let's market epilepsy as sexy, as something desirable and engaging. Let's market it as something everybody wants to have, just like any product you want to sell. So we decided to create the Gucci of public health campaigns. Let's celebrate people with epilepsy so beautifully, carefully, and meticulously that it becomes undeniable they are worthy. Worthy of careful attention, worthy of being fully informed, and worthy of health equality, worthy to survive. Let's craft joyful and strong metaphors to symbolize how informed and shared decision-making, patient-centric approaches, and complete disclosure of SUDEP prevention empowers people. Let's aim for Hollywood. Let's envision a happy ending for the 50,000 people who die of SUDEP every year. Let's dream of a happy ending for my son. Our photographer, Esther Hase, put this vision to reality. You have seen the images displayed on the screen. Esther is known for her dynamic and energetic photography. Her work combines fashion, fine art, and storytelling, resulting in vibrant images that often feature women in empowering roles. Her style was ideal for our campaign's needs. Without prior experience and being on a budget, I will touch finances briefly later, we took on the challenge of conducting our own casting for a high-end photo shoot. Embracing a hands-on approach, we were buoyed by the emotional support of a friend who made us believe that anyone could do it. Armed with a quirky photo taken by Esther, it's a small one right here, depicting an eccentric group including the former Queen of England and Mick Jagger, I think it is, we initiated our casting call to stop SUDEP. We reached out through social media and patient associations, and surprisingly, this approach was a success. Not only did we find our participants, I think I have to go. But we could also use the casting call itself as a part of our awareness campaign. Let me briefly outline our awareness building strategy. It is basically guided by megalomania. The SUDEP silence is a big and bad thing. It needs to be confronted bigly, we think. So we planned on going 360 with a digital out-of-home approach, aiming for widespread reach to anywhere, especially the public, and not stopping at our national border. Our approach encompasses digital, social, and traditional academic channels, extending from local digital billboards in Germany to global platforms. And also, we are now very proud to be included in a new book on neuropediatry. Pediatric neurology. So, which was written by Angela Kindle from Berlin and was just published a couple of weeks ago. So targeting the public at large does not only give you the opportunity to reach out to specific stakeholders, especially patients, healthcare providers, and potential sponsors. In my mind, it also acts as a reminder for healthcare givers that the SUDEP communication is inevitable. There is just no reason that sudden death in epilepsy is less known than sudden infant death or sudden cardiac death. So speaking of it should be a no-brainer. Let me briefly explain what we are showing. As mentioned in the campaign pictures, we utilize metaphors as symbols for the impact a patient-centric approach can make in medicine. This image, I think, speaks for itself. We see Angela Kindle, the director of Charity's Pediatric Neurology and Epilepsy Center in Berlin, as an authoritative figure in a stylized doctor's coat. She stands elevated, almost goddess-like, speaking into a large megaphone. She speaks SUDEP, and she's telling other doctors to do the same. This commanding visual is underscoring doctors' pivotal role in proactive SUDEP prevention. So this is Peggy. She has been diagnosed with epilepsy in her late 20s due to how to pronounce? Yes? She's a dancer, smart, passionate, and fun. And in this image, she is both vulnerable and empowered. She's protected by imposing metallic gauntlets, symbolizing the strength that comes with knowledge. Now here's an image with a metaphor that might not be immediately clear. It's meant to highlight the importance of using a seizure detection device or co-sleep. So basically having a watchdog on you or with you. But it does require a bit of explanation. So it might be a messaging fail, but I still like it. Yeah. If you talk about how to build a public awareness campaign, you have to mention funding. Funding is essential, obviously. Not surprisingly, we have encountered significant challenges to raise funds for two reasons. First, it's Germany, and potential sponsors and the government tend to not give away easily, especially not if you want money for a public campaign. And secondly, we were small and new. So we thus decided to self-fund the production of the campaign ourselves with the help of a few friends. And inspired by the economic theory of critical mass theory is basically saying that reaching a certain level of influence is key to getting noticed and getting funded. Our efforts are starting to bear fruit. The big DOH companies in Germany are now showcasing our campaign pro bono, Germany-wide, and potential sponsors as well as doctors are beginning to reach out. So the future has a horizon. Thank you very much for inviting me here.
I'm quite certain that everybody will agree that that is just tremendous. And to produce something from a place of loss, I can't really even imagine. It's just so impressive. Thank you for sharing it with us. I'm sorry for Dr. Simeone, because I feel like that's a challenging case to follow, but I know she can do it. I'm very pleased today to have Kristina Simeone join us. She is an associate professor of pharmacology and neuroscience at the Creighton University School of Medicine, and her research focuses on identifying preventive biomarkers and strategies for SUDEP. She's received awards from this work from the International League Against Epilepsy. She's worked with the American Epilepsy Society as well, and Society for Neuroscience. And today she's going to talk to us about what animal models can teach us about SUDEP prevention. Please.
All right, thank you for the invitation. For those of you who know me, I usually walk a lot when I talk, and so having to stand still at a lectern, I'll try my best to stay still. All right, so We have a forward button here.
That's the big green thing.
Oh, the big giant green button is okay. So today I'm going to talk about what preclinical models tell us about SUDEP prevention. So this is, well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. PAME is one of my favorite conferences. I feel that we have a week's worth of information and love that we experience all just packed into one day, really. And so this is one of my favorite conferences that I go to, so thank you for inviting me. So what preclinical models tell us about SUDEP prevention? So when we're thinking about this, please keep in mind that this is, the talk today is visionary. This is where we're going, where we need to be headed, and where we need to be moving forward. And so I'd like to start today by getting us all on the same page. So from the 50,000-foot view, we're all the same, right? We're all humans on Earth. But when you zoom in, you know that every one of us, each person is very unique and very, we're our own individual. And part of that uniqueness is because we have different ages, different socioeconomic lifestyles, we have different family heritage and cultures. Okay, we got over here. We have different habits when it comes to food and health and physical well-being, emotional intelligence and sleep habits, and all of this is wonderful because it allows us to be unique and it contributes to the diversification of society, but this is absolutely terrible for research because we're so unique. And so what preclinical research allows us to do is it allows us to control all the variables, and it allows us really just to test one thing at a time. So if we think, is this thing something that might increase SUDEP risk? We can test that in preclinical models, and then we can share it back to the clinic and say, yes, it might, yes, there's a high chance it might, or no, it may not. And so this is really, really important for the SUDEP field. So preclinical models have taught us a lot, but today I'm actually just going to talk about two important things that preclinical models have taught us. One, preclinical models they've allowed us to discover factors that influence risk, and two, in preclinical setting, and two, we're able to test treatments that might be useful in postponing or preventing SUDEP. So when I talk about preclinical models, I have two slides that kind of go through a little bit of background of preclinical models. You might have one species that you're investigating in a preclinical model, but within this species, there might be a lot of different SUDEP models. Preclinical models also involve just neurons or recording cells, and preclinical models can also just be looking at circuitry. So here we have, the hippocampal, it's just brain circuitry, and we can see whether or not the neurons are acting appropriately and responding appropriately, and we can test whether or not the circuits are hooked up correctly or normally or abnormally. So these are just some of our preclinical models. And what we do is we take clinical observations, and then we can test it in our preclinical models. And this can lead, I'm getting your hair with the laser, I'm sorry. This can lead to new discoveries, and it can really elevate our understanding of SUDEP. And then we can take that and apply it back to the clinic. And so today I'm going to share a story that's in part preclinical, and it's also in part a story that started by some of the observations made by PAME families a handful of years ago.
Do I need to move?
No, not at all. You're good. Yeah. You can stand up tall. I'll go. So we typically think of SUDEP risk as low risk and high risk, right? So, we have some of the epilepsy types aren't associated with SUDEP. If you have really well-controlled seizures, you're thought to be at lower risk. Whereas other epilepsy types are thought to be, you're at higher risk for SUDEP. If you have uncontrolled, very severe generalized tonic-clonic seizures, you're at a higher risk. So kind of throughout this talk, I'm going to use I'm going to use these gauges to kind of indicate where we are in our risk as we're going through some of this data. So we know some of the genetic mutations, like some mutations in sodium channels or in potassium channels, can increase our risk for SUDEP. But what this means is that in a population of individuals, some of the individuals will have the mutation, but within this population of individuals that have the mutation, only a handful of them will experience SUDEP. And so with this, we started to think, that this might mean, and others have thought this as well, that there's these other factors that might actually be increasing susceptibility in a very specific cohort of people that make them maybe more at risk for SUDEP. And so maybe these are things that the little pluses there are indicating maybe these are factors that are increasing susceptibility or increasing risk. The negative thing is maybe they're lacking something that would have been protective against SUDEP. And in addition, you have this other population of individuals that don't experience SUDEP. And so they were, maybe we can think of them as being protected against SUDEP. And so perhaps, hypothetically, maybe there's risk they don't have some of the things that would have made them more susceptible, or perhaps they have certain factors that make them a little bit more protected when you compare these two populations, because they all have the mutation. And so this would then, leads this population to be at lower risk. And so what we do in preclinical studies in our labs is we're trying to investigate and identify some of these factors that can increase risk, because then those are treatable options, or that decrease risk. And so in our preclinical studies, we have found some changes that are associated with increased risk in different models. And so not just our lab, but other labs have found these as well. And so we test some of these things in SUDEP models. And we have found these, so I have no graphs today. I'm just going to be listing things that have been found in the research community. So we found that sometimes risk is associated with sleep problems. There's an increase in risk. I'm going to go over here too, just to change it up. Sometimes there's an increase in SUDEP risk if you have more apnea, changes in your ability to detect carbon dioxide or hypoxia. We have found that there's increased risk when there's heart arrhythmias and when there's periodic drops in blood oxygen. And so we know that all these things are associated with increased risk preclinically. Some of this has been found clinically as well. And because we've identified some things, and there's other things too, I don't have time to go through all of it, but because we've identified some things, I shared some of this data several years ago at a PAME conference. And after I shared, my data at that point was fairly preliminary. And after the PAME conference, or after I shared my data at one of the breakout sessions, some of the family members came up to me. And one was a sister, she had lost her sister to SUDEP. And she said, you know what, right before my sister died, I was talking to her on the phone, and then she had died shortly later. I was talking to her on the phone, and she kept repeating the same sentence over and over and over again, and it was really weird. And then another mother came up to me and said, you know, my son said that he was starting to have circadian problems. Her son was an adult, and she goes, I didn't know what circadian was. I had to look it up. And there was other stories of other families who were saying that they noticed things that were different in their loved one before they passed to SUDEP. So now I'm going to step aside, and instead of talking about preclinical stuff for just one more minute, I wanted to share with you a survey that we conducted. So after talking to the families, there was a few of us, and we developed this survey to survey, it was an electronic survey on social media websites for SUDEP websites. And we were surveying families to see whether or not they noticed or remembered any differences in their loved one before SUDEP. And I'm presenting the data in the poster session later, and it was just recently published, but I'd like to just give you one graph from that. Oh, I lied earlier, I do have a graph, I have one graph. And so what we found is that if each one of the horizontal lines going across is a SUDEP victim, people that responded to the survey said that they did notice changes in these particular individuals. Everything on the x-axis or at the very bottom here, those are different changes. So changes in sleep, changes in heart rate, cognition, breathing, energy levels, emotional well-being, physical well-being. Those are the things that we surveyed for, and each one of these dots represents a change that they thought they remembered before their loved one died of SUDEP. This survey, it's very important, it's a pilot study. It was just a survey of what people remembered, because we wanted to give a voice. We were talking about epilepsy and SUDEP not really having a voice. We just wanted to get a voice and gather information from family members. So this is the information that we gathered. A lot of it we did not go through medical records to validate. This is just based on memory. But what it does is it does give us maybe a little bit of further rationale in supporting this idea that maybe there are some other factors that within an individual person might increase their susceptibility to SUDEP. Now, if we think about it and we zoom back out, there are likely hundreds of things that might increase risk, and we know of a couple of them preclinically. There's probably a lot more that we don't know. And if you think about it on the reverse side, there might be hundreds of things available that could decrease risk that we haven't yet really identified. And so that leads us into the second point that I wanted to make and share with you today is how we use preclinical models to test treatments that can maybe postpone or prevent SUDEP. Kind of going, if we go backwards here, kind of trying to find some of these things that might reduce risk. I'm going to go back over to this side now. And so, using different preclinical models, these are different labs now. There's been some treatments that have been identified that have shown some success in reducing risk in preclinical models. And so here, we found that improving sleep can reduce risk, reducing apnea, improving blood oxygen levels, using oxygen therapy. One study used music therapy. We know that listening to Mozart increases alpha waves in the brain, and whether that has anything to do, but in the music therapy study, that was really interesting that it reduced the risk of SUDEP after, after you were given, it increases the chance of survival in this preclinical model. There's specific medications that have been used to see whether or not it can postpone or prevent SUDEP. And so there's an orexin receptor blocker. There was one study using ibuprofen. There was a high throughput study of over 300 compounds. They found 5 synthetic CBD compounds. A cholesterol hydroxylase blocker was implicated in postponing or preventing SUDEP or increasing survival preclinically. And then there's CRISPR technologies where you treat with a gene, and the gene builds a protein, and that protein helps postpone or prevent SUDEP. And again, finding things that postpone or prevent SUDEP also supports this idea that SUDEP risk might be a little bit more dynamic. It might have a more dynamic range on a shorter time scale. And so within one individual, you might be at a moderately higher risk, but if other things are happening within you, your risk goes up. But then if you treat those things, maybe your risk can go back down, and that's what we're trying to study preclinically. And so what I've shown you is some things that have been identified, but each of these things have been identified in one model. And so what we need to do moving forward is we need to test, we need to look at all these different factors, identify new factors, and test them in multiple preclinical models. So that'd be the next step. And here I just wanted to spend another couple of seconds talking about the diversity of preclinical models that we have available to us. So over on the left is a list of models. These are rodent models. And so those models were generated because they're associated with the human genes that are known to be associated with SUDEP, so we made models based on those genetic mutations. Some of this cluster of models here, they all have spontaneous seizures, and they naturally have SUDEP, so it makes it, they have epilepsy and SUDEP, so that makes it very clinically relevant. There's other models down here where they have the genetic mutations associated with human SUDEP, but they don't have spontaneous seizures. But you can induce the seizures, and you can induce SUDEP. And that's very, very useful because then you can control when the seizure is happening. You can look at things before, you can look at things after, you can look at preventative strategies and do drug screening. You can also you can also induce seizures in these other models as well. And then over here, these are models that don't necessarily use genetic models that are associated with human SUDEP. There's other genes, but again, you can induce a seizure, you can induce SUDEP in these, and there's a higher likelihood of SUDEP occurring in these models, so it teaches us something about physiology in the system, so these are very important as well. There's non-genetic models as well, and then there's other species. So zebrafish is very useful because you can screen 300 compounds in a zebrafish model and then move up your discoveries to rodents, and then you can go into higher species like rabbits, canines, and baboons. These are the canines and baboons are more observational at this point, but the rabbit models are exciting. So we have all these, the preclinical field is really armed with a lot of models that can be very useful. And so, we're thinking like if SUDEP risk has a more dynamic range within one person on a shorter time scale, then we might be able to control it a little. So maybe the people with the mutation, maybe this person's at risk more when, when they're when they're sick or when they haven't had any sleep, and then they treat that, and then maybe their risk goes away. And maybe this person, something else happens to that person, and then they treat it, and maybe their risk doesn't go away. Maybe their risk lowers a little bit. This is what we're thinking. None of this has been proven. We're really early. This is just kind of where we're at in the field and what we need to test and verify. Now that would be wonderful, but it is probably just a little bit more complicated than that, because as we know, over here in the spoke and wheel diagram, you can see each one of these spokes is an epilepsy type. So there's many types of epilepsies. In addition, the factors that influence SUDEP risk might be different for each type of epilepsy. So we want to be mindful of that moving forward. Okay, my time's up. I'm going to go very quickly now, but this is the end. In addition, we want to be mindful of the fact that in one person, epilepsy can change throughout life, so can their treatments. So the risk factors might also change throughout life. So here. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, so now we're zooming out again. In the cancer field, it's been going strong for 200 years, cancer research. Preclinical studies for cancer, breast cancer, for example. It's a very simple condition. It is one tissue, it's breast tissue in one sex, in females primarily, right? There's over 9,000 clinical studies. This is just an example of, this is 5,000 studies this year, so this is how many studies per year for preclinical cancer research. So I want to compare now the SUDEP field and where we're at. We've come a long way, but that's where we're at. We're a very young field. We've only been around for a few decades, and our preclinical studies are still small compared to the cancer field. However, we have made remarkable progress. We still need to move forward quite a lot. And so thinking about being able to adjust risk is still new, and we don't know if it's true, and so that's why we need more research. So to conclude, translational research will drive a more intentional approach to personalized medicine for SUDEP prevention. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was great. Great graphics and perfect explanations. Moving on to thinking about SUDEP prevention, we have Dr. Shobi Sivathamboo, who is going to talk to us about how we can target clinical risk factors for SUDEP prevention. And Dr. Sivathamboo is a clinical researcher at Monash University and Alfred Health. She is in Australia, where she leads a SUDEP research group. Her interests include studying the national incidence and risk factors for SUDEP in Australia, identifying biomarkers for predicting SUDEP risk, and examining cardiac and respiratory disease in people with epilepsy, and developing out-of-hospital, non-invasive seizure detection devices for SUDEP prevention. So I welcome Shobi up. Thank you. You're right here. Thanks. It's the big green button. Okay, I'll be back. Okay.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and to PAME for this invitation to speak. I apologise in advance. My voice is not as soothing as Dr. Simone's. But yes, it's a really privilege to be a part of this session, which is really forward-thinking, and we're collecting all this information. But how do we maximise this to get to where we want to get, which is the ultimate goal of SUDEP prevention? So the overview of my talk today will go over what are the clinical risk factors for SUDEP, how do we prevent SUDEP, and what are the future steps. So this is the American Academy of Neurology task force paper that was published a few years ago now, which looked systematically at a review of all risk factors potentially associated with SUDEP, and only really a handful of clinical variables had a moderate to high association with either increased or decreased SUDEP risk. So importantly, it was the frequency of tonic-clonic seizures that carried the greatest risk of SUDEP. even having 1 to 2 tonic-clonic seizures in the preceding 12 months was associated with a 5-fold increased risk of SUDEP compared to someone who has no tonic-clonic seizures. And this risk increases even further if you have 3 or more convulsive seizures. The risk increases to over 15-fold. The presence of tonic-clonic seizures was also associated with a moderately increased risk, as well as not being seizure-free and not adding an anti-seizure medication when patients were refractory or having ongoing uncontrolled seizures. Importantly, this task force paper also identified that nocturnal supervision, as well as using a nocturnal listening device, was associated with a moderate level of risk reduction, which gives us some information as to where to design interventions for. So this is a really beautiful study done from Sweden, and this was subsequent to the task force paper and looked at 255 definite and probable SUDEP cases, and these were matched with 1,148 living epilepsy controls who were matched for sex and time. And they found, again, this strong association between tonic-clonic seizures and SUDEP risk. So in this study, it was over a 27-fold increased risk of SUDEP. But interestingly, it was combining the tonic-clonic seizures as well as a lack of nocturnal supervision at night that associated in this aggregate high risk of SUDEP over 67-fold, which is quite significant. So what's the current prevention for SUDEP? It's really controlling tonic-clonic seizures, and the mainstay of treatment is with anti-seizure medications. Both monotherapy and polytherapy have been associated with a risk reduction in SUDEP. Conversely, there are studies that show that non-adherence to anti-seizure medications may increase the risk of SUDEP. So in the North American SUDEP registry, NASA, they looked at how many people were on anti-seizure medications or who had taken their last dose, and only remarkably 37% of cases had anti-seizure medication levels at the time of death, which suggests that even though you may have well-controlled tonic-clonic seizures, a message in SUDEP counselling is to really drive medication compliance and adherence. Now, in the patients, there are about a third of patients who unfortunately don't respond to medications, despite the adequate trial of 2 or more appropriately chosen tolerated medications. And there are a number of interventions that can be targeted in this population. So epilepsy and neuromodulation, epilepsy surgery for those eligible candidates has been shown to be associated with low rates of SUDEP, so pretty similar to rates of SUDEP in an unselected general epilepsy population, so 1.9 per 1,000 patient years, which is much, much lower than those you would see in drug-resistant epilepsy populations, which can be up to 12 to 15 per 1,000 years. Vagus nerve stimulation is also associated with relatively low rates of SUDEP. There seems to be a more chronic effect that becomes evident in the 3 to 10 year mark, where the rates of SUDEP are lower in this period, which is 1.68 per 1,000 patient years. And it's hypothesized that VNS may have an additional cardioprotective effect by potentially affecting sympathetic outflow, which might have a chronic effect and become more apparent with not just controlling the seizures, but having an additional autonomic effect. And more recently, deep brain stimulation, as well as responsive neurostimulation in drug-resistant epilepsy have also shown to be associated with low rates of SUDEP. So what are some potential interventions for high-risk individuals? So a lot of these have been targeted around the bedside, which is where most SUDEP cases occur, and sharing a bedroom where practical with a bed partner or a child sleeping with their parent may decrease the risk of SUDEP. Medical technology is a huge and emerging field in this space. Seizure detection devices, such as the Empatica Embrace, which is FDA approved and works quite well for detection of nocturnal seizures, may identify those seizures, as well as motion detectors. And there's also pulse oximetry, which may detect dips in oxygen saturation overnight. But there are caveats to this because they do detect surrogate measures of seizures, but they don't detect or predict SUDEP risk, which is really important. And pulse oximetry is really helpful if it's used correctly, but a lot of patients with epilepsy also have comorbid sleep-disordered breathing, so it might result in quite a number of false positives overnight, which may not be helpful. Anti-suffocation pillows, so many patients are found in the prone position, which may aggravate their ability to breathe at that really critical time. So some anti-suffocation pillows may reduce the risk of rebreathing carbon dioxide, as well as decrease asphyxiation risk. And there have been a number of medications that have been looked into, such as moderate caffeine consumption, which is an adenosine antagonist, which is released after the seizure, which may have a respiratory depressant effect, so potentially consuming moderate amounts of caffeine may be protective, as well as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, which also may have a ability to affect respiration and respiratory depression, as well as statins have also been associated with a decreased risk of SUDEP, and whether that's again modulating excess sympathetic activity. And comorbidities, investigating and treating may also play a role, such as performing cardiac investigations, such as a routine ECG to rule out any cardiac problems, or more long-term measures such as an implantable loop recorder to look for things like asystole, as well as a sleep study to again screen for sleep apnea, which is quite common in adults and has an independent risk for sudden cardiac death, which, as we've spoken about earlier in some of the earlier sessions, there might be a strong overlap between the two, as well as identifying poor sleep and treating sleep, because those sleep-wake transitions can potentially increase the risk of seizures. However, the caveat is that none of these have been prospectively validated for SUDEP risk reduction, and that's really important, but a really challenging problem. So how do we do that? We need better predictive biomarkers. So risk factors are great to identify population-level patients who are at risk, but one person can have 100 tonic-clonic seizures and another can have 2 tonic-clonic seizures. Yes, yet the person who has a handful will pass away from SUDEP, yet another person may have hundreds and be fine. So this is some beautiful work from Viela and colleagues, which show this is a postictal EEG, which shows that the brain waves become flat after the seizure, and that's associated with depressed breathing, as well as decreased oxygen levels to a low of 63%. And to the right, there is a case report from our group which showed back-to-back tonic-clonic seizures, which elicited an abnormal heart rhythm, so atrial fibrillation, which can be irregular and rapid. In both of these cases, there was that diffuse brain slowing, which was associated with cardiac and respiratory changes. In both of these cases, patients unfortunately passed away from SUDEP subsequent to their admission. So it's possible that these sort of combined measures of brain shutting down as well as cardiorespiratory mechanisms might be more specific biomarkers. This is some of our work with Dan Friedman and Oren Dvinsky, which looked at heart rate variability during SUDEP cases from our worldwide case control study of SUDEP. So this is preliminary work from 31 SUDEP cases and 56 matched controls from 9 centres. And we found that a certain measure of heart rate variability, so low frequency power of heart rate variability, which has been implicated in an increased risk of a predictor of sudden cardiac death, we found that this was reduced significantly in patients who had died of SUDEP. And so we found that as this value decreased, the time to SUDEP kept decreasing. So the lower it was, the faster time to SUDEP. So where are we headed? What we really want to do is combine all this information and spit out who is at risk and what is your individual risk, because everybody is different. And this is very elegant work from Ash Jha, which only used clinical variables to develop an algorithm which looks at your individual risk factors, and it will compute your individual risk of SUDEP. And anything above that dotted line is at increased risk of SUDEP. So patient J has a much higher risk of SUDEP than patient A. But this alone isn't enough. And this is where we need to combine it with biomarkers. And this is part of our study that we're looking at. We're looking at ECG, EEG, as well as imaging biomarkers to then combine with risk factors for more personalized individual SUDEP prediction. So I think currently what SUDEP prevention looks like is it's really hard to distinguish who's at risk. And just because you have a tonic-clonic seizure, that doesn't mean you're going to die of SUDEP. So what we really need to do is identify those high-risk patients. So it could be those with multiple tonic-clonic seizures, but also abnormal brain or abnormal heart patterns. It could be someone with comorbid sleep apnea as well as postictal respiratory depression. This will then inform the development of targeted interventions, because this is going to give us more mechanistic insights into how SUDEP occurs, and it's likely very heterogeneous, and we've got very limited data as to what we've based this on, and most studies indicate that it's more centrally driven cardiorespiratory arrest, but it's likely heterogeneous. And then these high-risk individuals, we need to include them in prospective interventional studies to make them more feasible, because SUDEP trials are very difficult, because as much as SUDEP is too common, it's also a rare occurrence when you look at a population level. So we need to aggregate those cases to test prospectively these interventions. And then we can get to SUDEP prevention. And things like heart rate variability can be measured in an out-of-hospital environment. So it can be integrated to existing technology to make them less stigmatizing for patients with epilepsy and predict someone's risk of SUDEP. Because as much as acute interventions are good, they're really impractical and may not work in acute settings. So really we need to get to early prediction and prevention. So currently, in summary, our current prevention of SUDEP relies on controlling convulsive tonic-clonic seizures, where anti-seizure medications are the first-line treatment. In drug-resistant patients who are suitable, epilepsy surgery and neuromodulation might be effective in reducing that risk of SUDEP, but we need prospective studies, but they are met with, fraught with limitations due to how we would structure them prospectively. So we really need to identify predictive tools to identify high-risk patients to make them more feasible. And a better understanding of these risk factors and biomarkers will provide insights into how this happens and design more novel interventions with our preclinical colleagues for SUDEP prevention. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shobi. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Ingo Helbig to the podium. And extra big thank you, because I know you were double booked today. You were somewhere else in the morning and you're able to come here in the afternoon, to the extent that I didn't even have a chance to say hello. But welcome. So Dr. Helbig is a pediatric neurologist at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And he's trained in Germany, in Kentucky, in Australia. He's led big initiatives in Europe with regards to epilepsy genetics, and finally settled at CHOP, at least for now, in 2014. And today he's going to talk to us about how genetics can move us towards SUDEP prevention.
Thank you. And so Thank you for kind of making my double booking possible. This was really a bad plan on my end. So what I would like to do today is kind of give everybody an overview on how epilepsy genetics factors into our understanding of SUDEP and premature mortality and epilepsy more broadly. So what I would like to do just in this audience who probably doesn't hear about genetics all that much, I'd like to give an overview of where testing is at, especially because there are probably some misunderstandings and genetic testing is much different than most people actually think. And then I'll talk about some of the common genetic diagnoses that we find. I want to then talk about how these genetic variants are linked to an increased risk of premature mortality and whether this is actually true and how we can actually use existing data to link this further. And finally, I want to look at what genes are really kind of prominent in there and how we can kind of sometimes think about risk through so-called incidental findings and what they mean.
So for 12 minutes.
This is going to be 9 minutes. So genetic discoveries in the epilepsies is kind of happening at a rapid scale. And there are literally hundreds of diagnoses that are being discovered. And all these kind of black little items on the axis are genes that have been discovered in the last 10 years. Genetic testing is kind of done at a very gigantic scale. And this is something that people often don't realize. This is only a study here that looks at 3 years of data from diagnostic labs that have tested more than 25,000 individuals with epilepsy. And it's not the number 25,000 that actually matters, but if you look at the x-axis at the bottom, you see the number 600, and those are the number of individuals who've had a single diagnosis diagnosed in this group. So more than 600 individuals within 3 years with a diagnosis of an SCN1A-related epilepsy or Dravet syndrome. So this is data from our center that gives you an idea of when testing is typically performed in children and how early we actually are. There are some genes that we diagnose very early, for example, KCNQ2. There are some genes that are diagnosed very, very late. And this is, for example, the DEPTEC5 gene that you've seen in the previous presentations as well. It's one of the genes for focal epilepsies. So it depends on when these epilepsies present. But genetic testing typically happens at a much broader scale and much earlier than we would typically think, and is way more accessible. So what does a genetic diagnosis actually do? Here's an idea where we have 4 different genetic changes, and you can see this dotted line in the middle. And what we're looking at here is basically data from the medical records that compares medication prescriptions before and after the genetic diagnosis. You've heard earlier that kind of adjusting medications, optimizing medications is one of the most effective ways to prevent SUDEP. And this is what is shown here. This is what a genetic diagnosis does. It kind of changes medication in practice. So this is real world data that we just kind of pulled from our large data source. So how are these variants now linked to the risk for SUDEP? So let me talk about some challenges first. All genetic diagnoses are rare, and premature mortality or SUDEP is rare. So we have to see how we can kind of make sense of this combination. Especially in rare epilepsies, we have a very large number of what we call rare disease communities. And it is often very difficult to dissect what is really linked to a specific gene versus what is linked to the disease severity. And this is going to be a theme that I'll come back to in the next few minutes. How much of the SUDEP risk can be attributed to the gene itself, and how much is due to the severity of the epilepsy. Those are different things. So there is an increased risk of SUDEP in genetic epilepsy, to state this very, very clearly, and this is something that has been shown in many different kind of lines of evidence, unfortunately often in very small case series, given that these conditions are so rare. And there are a number of genes that kind of come up over and over again. This is the SCN1A gene, which is the gene that has been most prominently mentioned in the setting of premature mortality. SCN8A, this is a epilepsy where kind of there are often children who kind of pass away very, very early. And then the DEPTEC5 gene. And DEPTEC5 stands out a little bit because this is the gene that you would not expect. Many of these genetic epilepsies we diagnose early in childhood. DEPTEC5 is a gene that causes a focal epilepsy. It is not different from an epilepsy that we would kind of send to pre-surgical evaluation. So this diagnosis is out there and probably way more common than we would think. So here is now a kind of figure from a study from the Australian group by Ingrid Scheffer that looks at causes and the age of death in patients with developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, which are the kind of more severe epilepsies. And you can see that this happens relatively early in the first 10 years of life, and the most common gene that is affected here is the SCN1A gene that causes Dravet syndrome. Overall, the SUDEP rate is roughly 2.8 per 1,000 patient years. You've seen on the previous presentation, this is where the numbers typically are for refractory epilepsy. And for Dravet, this is increased at least by the factor of 2. So we have at least a 4 or 5 times 5 per 1,000 patient year risk in patients with this specific genetic epilepsy. So this is something that we kind of see, as well. And this is actually a very nice table to kind of give you an idea how we need to dissect the SUDEP risk and other risk for premature mortality. For example, in the KCNQ2 and KCNT1 genes, we have a higher mortality risk, but this higher mortality risk is likely not due to SUDEP. This is often due to autonomic dysfunction. This is often due to kind of, sepsis-like events that we don't really understand. And this is important to kind of keep in mind because we need to modify other risk factors there. In other conditions, such as SCN1A, we need to really work on the epilepsy and controlling this. So here's now a kind of data-driven approach for this. What this is going to show is on the x-axis you have patient age, on the y-axis you have patients stacked when they kind of appear in the medical record system. Every single dot is a patient encounter, so a patient note that your kind of doctor leaves in the chart, and every horizontal line is a single individual. And this kind of looks at basically an entire system of patients with SCN1A mutations. So this covers in our center roughly 500 or 600 patient years. What we find here is 2 individuals who've kind of passed away with SCN1A, and this gives us a measurement of roughly 4 in 1,000 patient years. So this kind of matches the previous data, and again supports this line of evidence that we have this increased risk in this specific genetic epilepsy. What is interesting here is that we're not the first people looking at this. So over the years, the SUDEP risk in Dravet has actually decreased probably from 16 in 1,000 patient years to 4 in 1,000 patient years. So this is barely reported in the literature, just because these estimates are always based on small numbers. But these numbers used to be much higher in the past. And this gives us one idea of what genetic testing can actually do. It creates better care, and better care leads to a lower risk. So how are these variants now kind of linked to premature mortality? So are there other ways that we can kind of look at genes for epilepsy and the possibilities of kind of the risk of having premature mortality? So we started a collaboration with the registry for kind of a sudden unexpected death in childhood, and we've basically kind of done exome analyses there. And this is basically with Laura and Oren, and I'm very thankful for this collaboration, which has been very insightful for us. So we're not a cardiac analysis group, we're kind of an epilepsy genetics group, but our team really wanted to do this. Our genetic counselors were really interested in kind of doing this project, and so we kind of took on the analysis of this here. We know that we can kind of separate this out in terms of SIDS. Sometimes we find epilepsy genes in patients who have sudden infant death syndrome, but this happens very rarely. In many cases, when we find genetic changes, those are metabolic conditions, or those are arrhythmia genes. When we look at sudden death in childhood, we also see genes that are sometimes implicated in cardiac conditions. So at the bottom, you can see a number of genetic changes, and those are mainly genes in cardiac conditions, so they have no relationship to epilepsy per se. But what is a recurrent theme are these genes that I highlighted in yellow. We find SCN1A again as a gene, or other genes linked to autism or intellectual disability. So this is, again, independent lines of evidence that there's something about epilepsy genes that increases the risk for premature mortality. How can genetics help? So it is very important, and it is kind of standard of care to do genetic testing in individuals who have a non-trivial epilepsy. And this is something that I want to say very, very plainly. I'm a pediatrician, so these things are easier for us in the pediatric sphere because of the way that we do testing, but this is slowly seeping into the adult epilepsy knowledge as well that genetic testing is just part of it. Yeah? A genetic test is not more expensive than an MRI. It gives us actionable data. Yeah? And when I sometimes get the question, why is this necessary, or how would this change things, I sometimes look bored and say, that's actually a question the last person asked me this 5 years ago. Yeah? So this is the standard. So when we do genetic testing, there are different ways on how we can do this. The most comprehensive test is called a whole exome sequencing test. And whole exome sequencing allows us to kind of also test for what is called incidental findings. When I typically send a test for epilepsy, this test doesn't kind of test for arrhythmia genes or cancer genes. But if we do incidental findings, there's a very protocolized, a very standardized way how we can return results with regards to other genetic risk factors that have been very established. So people have worked on decades for understanding which things put you at risk, how they can be intervened upon. And this is something that is always beneficial, and we occasionally find patients who have secondary findings or incidental findings, and then we can kind of send them to a cardiologist and kind of help with intervention there. The other thing is that we really need to understand better what the contributing factors are. So you've seen I've used these terms interchangeably, premature mortality and SUDEP. The kind of risk for premature mortality, SUDEP and non-SUDEP, is often not delineated, is often not differentiated in the literature. And the question is, how much is the gene, how much is the severe epilepsy caused by the gene, is something that is extremely important to dissect. On the one hand, we have to work on therapies against the genetic change. On the other hand, we need to control epilepsy better. You know? And so those are these kind of things why genetic testing can contribute to this picture. It completes our understanding of someone's epilepsy. And I'm speaking here as a epilepsy genetics clinician who's basically kind of seen how my understanding of a person's epilepsy just gets turned around and is being kind of shown in a completely different light once we have a genetic testing back. So I was asked to stay at 12 minutes, which I did. Yeah.
Very impressive.
Thank you. So I gave you an idea about kind of what genetic testing is, where we are with epilepsy genetics, how genes are linked to the premature mortality, and what other factors are out there that might kind of contribute to this increased risk of dying in the setting of epilepsy. Thank you.
Thank you, and I will invite all our speakers up at the end to address questions and have some discussion. So our last speaker, coming up behind me is Dr. Daniel Goldenholtz, who is an assistant professor at Harvard Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And Daniel has expertise in electrical and biomedical engineering, biostatistics, neuroradiology, and epilepsy. In his lab, the Epilepsy and Data Science Lab works to leverage advanced tools to help people with epilepsy. So Daniel also has a family member with epilepsy and therefore hates the disease from the depth of his being. We appreciate that, as do most of us, I think. And so I've asked Daniel today to talk to us about how we can use AI to prevent SUDEP. Big green button.
Big green button. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you all for being here and for putting up with the last speaker at the end of the day. I hope you have enough caffeine to go for a few more minutes. I have a few pictures in my talk, and all but the last one are AI generated. The question that we're going to talk about is how AI can prevent SUDEP, or can it actually, AI being artificial intelligence. And so I have here asked an artificial intelligence to dream up a picture for me. On one hand, a terrible dragon that seems very fearsome and dangerous, and a mighty warrior of a robot to come and fight and battle him. And so the question is, can AI help for prevention? And so, yeah. So thank you very much.
Off you go.
I always wanted to do that. So
You did it.
okay. So this also is an AI-generated picture, and I'm highlighting this because I didn't draw them and I didn't think of them myself. I asked an AI to do this for me, and the idea is that AI can do a lot of neat things. One of the things that it can do is find hidden patterns, and we've heard some amazing examples in the news. For example, you can look in the back of someone's eye, take a picture of it, and ask an AI about that picture, and it can tell you the cardiovascular risk for the next 10 years of that patient. So that's a hidden pattern in the back of the person's eye. Forecasting risk, of course, our models for weather have been recently found to be wholly inadequate, and that AI can do much, much better than what we've been doing up until now, and we can do much more accurate, much longer prediction windows using artificial intelligence tools. In addition, we're able to come up with the optimal decision. And so an example of that is AI beating the best chess player and the best Go player in the world. Although that seems trivial and almost irrelevant, when there are an unimaginably large number of choices in these simple games, that translates to the clinic when we have an almost unimaginable number of choices of which medicine, which way, which dose, how come, should I do surgery, should I do that procedure? And the combinations end up being so astronomical that we can't try everything, and it's the same problem. And finally, creative approaches. When you're looking at a problem and you say, I just don't know. I've got this problem, I don't understand it, it's called SUDEP, I don't know what to do, I know some epidemiological facts, what should I do next? Sometimes you just need a creative boost, and now we are seeing, especially this past year, a number of incredible tools to boost our own creativity through words, through images, through three-dimensional things, through audio, through video, and so on. So let's translate this into things that actually matter to us, for our patients, and for SUDEP. Specifically, we're going to talk about these 4 things, and I'll get into that. In terms of diagnosis, I put a little star, for each of these sections, I put a little star next to things that I personally have been working on, but there's a number of other brilliant scientists working on this as well. In collaboration with others, I'm working on EEG interpretation, so we can take a raw EEG and ask an AI to extremely accurately give us a diagnosis, give us detailed information about what's going on in there. Similarly, we can do that with imaging from MRI, from PET scans, CAT scans, and so forth. Genetic diagnosis can be daunting as we look at thousands and thousands of genes, some of which we know the names of, some of which we don't understand at all. And we need help from a system that is never tired and is always a similar amount of accuracy, and often better than us. And then when it comes to pre-surgical evaluation, how am I supposed to figure out who should go to surgery and where should that surgery be? I think I know, I've been trained like, everyone else that does this sort of thing. And the truth is that there's a lot of guesswork, and there's a lot of, well, maybe this sort of looks like a temporal lobe case and they have a 43.6% chance, but really we're guessing a lot of times. And until we really bring in a lot more information and automate it and make it more accurate, we're not going to do a better job with pre-surgical evaluation. Therefore, we're not going to do a better job for surgery, and therefore we're not going to prevent as much SUDEP. And finally, to identify risk levels, there are people that obviously, like we heard at other talks, there are obviously people that are high risk and medium risk and low risk, and maybe they change over time, and who are they and when are they? This is something that we can ask AI to help us with, and it's much easier for it to do it than for our brains to do it. Moving on to monitoring, of course we want wearables. Of course we want to know, when did our loved ones have an episode? When should we rush in to intervene? How sick are they, and so forth, and we need as much objective data as possible. And trying to understand that information, which is now enormous enormous volumes of data is going to be impossible for a human to do. We need help from artificial intelligence to continuously monitor and accurately identify patterns of risk and danger and alert us at those times. On the same note, we can build smart rooms that are not touching us and are not attached to us, but are monitoring us and making sure that we're safe at night, for example. And I mentioned already surgical candidates, but not just when we've already decided, okay, they're going to be a surgical candidate. How about before they've ever been considered as a surgical evaluation? Maybe we should be monitoring our electronic medical records continuously, and several studies have been published on this, that it's possible to use natural language processing in order to identify who might be good candidates before the doctor's ever considered that option. Of course, seizure forecasting is very important on many people's minds. I'd love to know when that next seizure is going to happen before it happens, so that I can take extra medicine, so that I can maybe do safer behaviors and so forth. There are very, very exciting early signs that this may work. We'll see. The jury's out, but it's, you know, if we can do it, it's not going to be with our own brains. That part's clear. It's going to be with the help of artificial intelligence. And then SUDEP risk monitoring, again, when your SUDEP risk is high and low, it doesn't seem like it stays there forever. It seems like it's there for a period of time, and then it goes down, and it goes up, and then it goes down. Keeping an eye on that would be helpful if we had appropriate interventions. And again, the mountain of data coming out of something like that would require the assistance of an artificial intelligence. As far as treatment, I need to choose what medicine my patients have. And I have methods that I've made up as the years have gone by, and they seem to work okay. Some of my patients are happy. But let's be honest, it's educated guessing. And until we collaborate as a species and put all of our collective knowledge together and all of our collective experience together, and ask for help from an artificial intelligence that can be more comprehensive than us, we're going to keep on screwing up. We need help. And where is that going to come? That's artificial intelligence again. There are some parameters for our neuromodulation tools that we are expected to guess out of our brilliant doctor minds, and I apologize. I don't know how to do it properly, and it's not due to lack of training. It's not due to the fact that I have an engineering degree, whatever. But it's guessing. We don't know the way to optimize these parameters yet for the individual, for their individual risk moment at that time. And there may be ways to look at the holistic patient, maybe their genetic profile, maybe their cycles, maybe everything, and say, for you right now, these parameters would be the best. And there have been some early signs that something like this is possible. We've looked at clinical decision support for risk reduction and giving suggestions to the patients and to the physicians. This might be the right time to treat for clusters. This might be the wrong time to treat for clusters, for example. And again, you would want the help of artificial intelligence here, because the kind of math involved is not something that you can do on a calculator or on a napkin. You would require a very sophisticated level of work, or simply offload this to an AI that could do this unceasingly and never get tired. What kind of stimulation therapy do we need? Maybe this type of patient needs a low level all the time, and maybe that patient only needs one stimulation per day. And maybe this patient needs a stimulation here and a stimulation there. And figuring out which parameters are appropriate in a space of nearly infinite sets of combinations, that's when you want help from an intelligence greater than yourself. And finally, closed loop control. I published a beautiful review with the help of some other folks of the idea of focal cooling in a closed loop system. So you could have a machine that is watching all the time. Is there a seizure coming? Is there a seizure? Oh, this looks like a seizure. I'm going to activate the cooling. It cools down that local area of the brain, stops the seizure. The rest of the brain continues to function. The seizure's over, the cooling stops, brain goes back to normal, nothing's been destroyed, and the cycle repeats over and over again. This can't be controlled by a little guy sitting in the corner. It's going to have to be an artificial intelligence to monitor us continuously. And moving on to research, what drugs have we not found yet? There may be ways to use artificial intelligence to identify new drugs for us by understanding the properties of chemicals, by understanding the properties of molecules and proteins, shapes of those molecules. We may be able to screen out and identify drugs in order to figure out which ones we should be testing with the help of AI, and there's been some exciting examples of that. Similarly, once you have these candidate drugs, we might be able to do some high throughput screening where we challenge a bunch of mice, and without waiting 6 months to see how they're doing, very quickly identify, okay, this one is working, this one's not working, this one's creating a large number of side effects, and so forth. And there's some very exciting work in that area using artificial intelligence and imaging technology. My lab published an interesting idea about maybe doing a randomized control trial prediction. Once you get the patients that you want for your study, after you've enrolled them, before you give them whatever intervention it is, there might be some ways to predict how well this trial is going to go, because different patients are different, as we know. There are the people that are very sick, medium sick, and not so sick. And different levels of sickness involve different statistical contributions to the overall trial. If I knew the population that you're giving me, I might be able to make some predictions to help you figure out how likely this trial is going to move forward in the direction that you want. And then several other studies that my group has published is on accelerating the randomized control trials. How do we do them for less money, with faster, with less exposure, and so on. I think there's a lot of room for improvement in our current model of evaluating anti-seizure medications. All of these things can be done with the help of artificial intelligence, again, just to be more efficient than our puny little brains, basically. And then, what's that last one?
Mechanism discovery.
Mechanism discovery, right? So how can I figure out what is SUDEP, right? Like, I don't know. We've seen many different ideas today and in other conferences and in textbooks and in papers, but we actually don't know yet what is the reason everybody is having these problems. Is it one reason? Is it 15? Is it 406? And what are the specific pathways, and how are we going to figure this out? It might be that there's going to be a brilliant collection of investigators who are going to crack the code and explain it all to us next year at AES, or this year. But more realistically, it's going to probably be with the assistance of artificial intelligence that can gather lots of information, digest it all at the same time, and come back and say, look, there's a pattern that if you look over there, and over there, and back there, and over there, and over there, all of those things combine, and this mechanism is the way that it seems to be occurring. So I see that this is something that we obviously need for SUDEP. So can AI help? Absolutely. So in these 4 domains, my answer is yes. And this is my lab's motto: relentless incremental improvement. That's the only picture on that corner that isn't AI generated, and that's 3D printed, because I want to learn how to do that. So all by myself with a machine. So anyway, thank you for your time.
Okay, that was a great way to end, because I'm feeling super hopeful. I'm also thinking I need AI. I'm like an AI dummy or whatever, and now basically Daniel's convinced me that I need it for many things. Okay, so we have a few minutes for questions. So do I have any questions from the audience? Yes. I don't know if someone's walking around with mics, but can you shout? Oh, good question.
Yeah. Where do you get the data? Well,
where do you get the data is the question.
Well, I mean, right now, the answer is usually the same. There's a small collection of data that came from here, or a small collection of data that came from there. Maybe this hospital has been collecting for the last 10 years, or that hospital's been collecting for the last 5. Maybe there's a small consortium of 5 hospitals that got together and put something together. I alluded to this before, that until we get together as a species, we're not going to solve some of these bigger problems. So my answer to where do I get my data, some of it is exactly these things, these little small collections from one place or collaborations from several places. But I don't think that that's where we have to go. If we actually want to get to a better place with SUDEP, we need to know a lot more, not a little bit more. And we need to stop the silos and we need to work together. There's a lot of barriers to that. There's legal, there's technical and so on, but there's a lot of solutions for those things. So I think what you're asking me is like, how will we get the data for all the stuff that I said? My answer to you is when we digitize medicine completely, and when we make medicine interoperable completely, and when we agree as a species that it actually matters, that we're all healthy, that's when we're going to get the data.
Hey, thank you. At the back.
Daniel, this is Brandy Fuhrman from Epilepsy Foundation, way in the back. I loved your answer just now, but I wanted you to expand on the issue of variability within the data itself. So even once we solve the legal problems, even once we get the data sharing agreements in place, can you speak to what kind of challenge we're going to face when we get to the point at which we bring all this data together and it's not in standard elements?
Yeah, it stinks. But this is the whole point. Okay, so if somebody makes a beautiful little data table with an X and a Y, then I can ask a high school kid to put it together and make a cute little graph without any computers or anything, and it'll work beautifully. But if instead you give me a whole giant pile of garbage on the table and say, go find the answer here, then I'm going to be lost. And that's sort of the point. What I've done with my research is I've taken small piles like that, that's unstructured and in a big mishmash and full of noise, all sorts of problems, and said, look, there are ways to statistically look at these things and still find important information within the noise, so to speak. And I think that the same thing is true for AI in general. When it looks at a photograph and is able to identify a hidden pattern in that photograph, for example, the cardiovascular risk from a retina image, that's because there's a lot of noise and there's a small amount of signal, and AI is very good at that exact process. So how exactly is that process going to happen? It's beyond my intelligence. That's the whole point. If we provide the appropriate data, and that's the key, if we provide the appropriate data to the appropriate machine learning algorithms, then we will be able to extract hidden information. What we're going to extract is, I obviously didn't extract it yet, so I don't know.
Thank you. Over there.
I couldn't but just comment on this point because I think I was reminded a bit on the situation that we had when real evidence data stories came up like 20 or 30 years ago. So I think it still will depend on the quality of the data that you put into the system. If you have, it's that wording that garbage in, garbage out. So even if you have a lot of data, if it's not of good quality, and the example you gave with language processing is probably poor because there's still a lot of gap, even if you try to interpret medical records written by physicians, they may be uninterpretable because they are not complete and there are lots of gaps in these type of data. So it's still a question of not only to have the data itself, but also about the quality of the data.
So I would agree with you to an extent, but I've heard this complaint before and I've seen the counterexample. The counterexample is that if you take messy data and you say this is garbage, you definitely will learn nothing from it. On the other hand, if you take messy data and say, I believe there is signal in here, but it may be buried, and you are careful at looking at that data, you may find surprises. And this is what we did with a number of studies from Seizure Tracker, which is completely self-reported data, no physician curation, full of all kinds of caveats and reasons to not believe it. And we've seen again and again that the results that we came out from those data match the kinds of informations you see from intracranial EEG, from curated physician curated data sets. And we find that although you could assume that poor data is garbage, you could also assume that poor data is poor data and that there's something in there. If you look at it that way, then I think that there's a lot more to be gained from data that is not perfect.
Can I back you up?
Yeah, please.
Ingo, go ahead.
So I think this is a very typical kind of trajectory of the discussion. We talk about data heterogeneity. Someone sets up, at some point, someone is going to set up and say garbage in, garbage out, and then typically this kills this discussion.
Yeah.
In reality, messy data is beautiful. Yeah? Because it's the only thing that we have. But I think, so I come from the genetic field, and I think what we have is we have very standardized genetic data, and what we try to do is kind of say, what can we harmonize in terms of clinical data on top of this? So what data can we kind of infer or create that we can kind of compare across everybody? Yeah? And there's actually quite a bit of science in there, and the science can use AI, the science can use very normal methods, and I think this kind of the idea of like data harmonization, how much you can actually get out in terms of information out of data that initially appears very shallow, but can be harmonized is unexplored and is very, very deep. So sometimes when we do this, we get an increase of like 10 times, 100 times more information content from this data.
So I also will say that as a clinical researcher, if I wait for beautiful data, I'll never answer any questions or even try to answer any questions. So sometimes you just have to go for it. I'm going to chair's prerogative here. I have a question for Iris. I'm wondering if you can tell us what type of response you've had to the campaign in Germany. Are people, how do people respond when they see this? This mic, please.
Is it on? Is it working?
Yeah, no, it is. Maybe move it a bit closer.
It depends on
Oops, sorry.
Working?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have mixed reactions. I had mixed reactions. So people who don't have a connection to epilepsy, it makes them talk about it.
Yeah.
It lessens the stigma. It's an opener.
Okay.
To start a conversation. But with the patients, with the epilepsy patients, for them it was a very unusual visualization of their illness. And so we had reactions like, this is not the reality is harsh, you don't know what I have to bear when I'm in the hospital, and they're doing EEG stuff. And so you really have to explain to them that it's fiction.
It's a technique, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
You mentioned trying to make epilepsy sexy and SUDEP sexy, and in fact, I had that discussion once with a celebrity, and he wanted to know, well, what could he do for epilepsy? And I said, you need to make epilepsy sexy because nobody cares about epilepsy. And I can see, like, you know, the reality of drinking beer isn't models on sports cars either, but that is how they sell beer. And so, you know, amazing, just blows me away. I think we have to call quits because Gardner's bearing down on me here from this side. So I just want to thank this group. I have questions for all of you, so I'll just take them offline. Oh, I'm supposed to hand out books. And say a tremendous thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
I'm just welcoming up George Richardson to share some awards. Is that right?
That's right.
Awesome.
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for coming and for your enthusiastic involvement all day. It's been very intellectually stimulating, but also emotionally taxing day. And so I invite you after this to go next door to a reception where you can relax and decompress, and then also look at posters. And the room that the reception is in is going to be the room that the posters are in. So that's just right next door. And we're going to carry on the tradition from the last few years of awarding, giving awards out for the top posters as determined by our eminent panel of judges. So I'd like the award winners to come up when I call out their names. The first one is Marianne Lazage. The title of the poster was Impact of Comorbid Sleep Disorders on Mortality Risk in Patients with Epilepsy. You can come up here and then we can get a photograph that way. The next one is Benton Purnell on disruption of adenosine metabolism in mice increases risk of seizure-induced death despite decreased seizure severity, implications for SUDEP. And the last one is for Patrick Wohler. The title of his poster is Altered PI3K mTOR Signaling Within the Forebrain Leads to Respiratory Deficits in a Mouse Model of SUDEP. Oh, yeah. Actually, I'm afraid I don't have. I'd like to thank the Abstract Review Committee, Gordon Buchanan, Kristina Simeone, and Frank Kalume. So thank you very much for your efforts. And I'll turn over the podium to Jeff Buckhalter.
Okay, so we'd like to end the day the way we started the day. We started with a number of people basically saying what PAME meant to us and has meant to us. We'd like to have sort of an open mic and have people volunteer and say what PAME has meant to you. What did you get out of it? What was the value? And so if you'd like to raise your hand, Gardner will bring over the microphone. At least one person has to say it was valuable. Or you can't go to the reception.
My name is Shelley Frappier. I am the Director of Patient Engagement at the Acute Syndrome Foundation, and I directly support patients with SCN 8A epilepsy. And I always come away from this meeting feeling really empowered to better support my families through their journey and share the information back to them about their risks of SUDEP and how awful. And it's an awful job, but I always feel empowered doing it, coming from this meeting.
I'm Laura Lubbers. I'm from Cure Epilepsy, and I'm always so inspired by this meeting, the collaborations that are coming out, the research is moving forward, the way our discussions bring us forward to that next step. I think it's a really exciting trajectory, and it's just, while it is incredibly difficult emotionally to be here, we've all shed tears, it feels hopeful. So thank you.
Hi, my name's Constance. My daughter Grace died of SUDEP in 2021, and I just wanted to say I appreciate so much of what I've heard in the last 2 days. I appreciate what the family advocates are doing, who I think are incredibly brave, wonderful people. I am so grateful to hear what the researchers and scientists and doctors are doing. Thank you. so much. I have another daughter with epilepsy, and I am so grateful to know that you're out there fighting and working on this. And I'd also like to thank the organizers, all those people who put everything together in ways that I don't even see behind the scenes. It just has made such a difference to myself and will make a difference to my family. So thank you.
Run.
I think we probably should have had 1 or 2 more microphones.
It's my getting my steps in.
Yeah.
I've been sitting all day.
Give her a break.
So I'm a basic scientist, so I don't have the privilege of meeting patients. And so I love this meeting. I love PAME because I love interacting with the family members. And so that is it's a unique situation, or it's a unique opportunity for me. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Maggie. My sister Molly passed away in May, so I'm just really appreciative to everyone who's here, especially all of the family members who have reached out to me, given me a hug while I've been crying. I really, really appreciate the concept of being normally broken here and just being here in my grief and honoring my sister. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tiffany Norwood, and I have a 4-year-old son with epilepsy. And I just want to thank everyone, that was here and spoke, and the family advocates. It's leaving me with like a punch list of different things to go home and hopefully do to prevent mortality with my son. I don't even like thinking about it, and my heart goes out to all of the family members that I heard from the last couple of days.
Hi, I'm Frank Alume, and as a basic scientist, like my friend Kristina, I would like to say this is always a great opportunity for me too, because it shined a light somewhere and give me a way, a path to go through my career and to helping people with epilepsy, and especially those at risk of sudden unexpected death. And there are always new ideas that we discover here that will help us continue this fight.
Hello, my name is Frank Harris. I'm with the Chelsea's Hope LaForest Children Research Fund. I wanted to send this message to the researchers and the clinicians. You people have no idea how lucky you are. You get to go to work every day and try to save lives. And that is precisely what we need you to do. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everyone since I've got the mic in my hand. I love that we're all here. I'm just so grateful for everyone for digging in again and again on this issue, and I think we are making progress, even if it does feel incremental. But lots of good signs here. So please go next door, enjoy yourselves, learn, meet new people, and come back next year. We'll be in LA. Oh, most importantly, I don't know where the QR code is, Anne, but there is an evaluation QR code, and if we don't show it to you, it's in the program. Thank you. It's in the program, and I think we'll also email it out. But please, please fill that out for us. Thanks again. Jeff?
And since I have the microphone and the podium, Trump, I just want to end by thanking Gardner Lapham, our fearless leader, for making it all happen. And Anne Gramiak from AES, who operationalized everything. So,
See you next door.